The wind howls like a ghost across the cold fjords. Somewhere, a longship creaks in the dark, still and forgotten. But once, these waters churned with fury, and the world trembled beneath the boots of men who lived like legends and died like storms. The Vikings, raiders, poets, explorers, and paradoxes in flesh. They burned villages and buried their dead with gold. They worshipped gods of chaos, yet followed codes of honor. And for every axe raised in war, there was a rune carved in silence. Tonight, you won't just hear their history or drift through its contradictions. These are the wildest moments in Viking history, retold as 25 ancient paradoxes, each one stranger than the last. So dim the lights, close your eyes, and let the old world open like a saga. Because in the north, even time gets lost between truth and myth. Let the paradoxes begin. They called it drengre, a Viking word that once meant bravery, nobility, honor. But in the Viking world, honor was not defined by restraint or mercy. It was often proven through blood. A young warrior might earn his honor by slicing open a monastery door and dragging monks from their prayers. He could gain eternal glory not by saving lives but by ending them, efficiently and without hesitation. And yet, in the heart of this violence was a deeply coded sense of justice, duty, and pride. To kill for gold was greed, but to kill for clan or god, that was sacred. This is the paradox where brutality and righteousness lived in the same breath. To outsiders, the Vikings were barbarians, but to themselves, they were the swords chosen, a people who believed their violence was not only necessary but honorable. What made it savage was not the act, but the intention behind it. Consider the thing. Their public assembly, a democratic council where disputes were settled by law. Here, a man might be judged not for killing but for killing dishonorably. To slay an enemy in battle brought pride, but to murder in secret, or to strike a man who had not drawn his weapon, that brought shame. So, a Viking's life was a tightrope of blood and code. Too gentle, and you were mocked. Too wild, and you were cursed. A true warrior walked that blade edge, perfectly savage enough to defend kin, but bound by an inner rule of fairness. It's said that some Vikings would call out to their enemies before striking, to ensure the fight was mutual. Others left weapons near their fallen foes so they might reach Valhalla properly armed. Their gods reflected this paradox. Odin, the wise Allfather, also loved war and deception. Thor protected mortals but with a hammer that shattered skulls. Even Bald, the purest of them all, died by betrayal. There were no clean heroes in their mythology, only powerful beings caught between destruction and purpose. Just like the people who worshipped them, Viking honor also required feuding. Endless cycles of revenge that could last generations. If your brother was slain, you were bound to avenge him or lose face forever. It didn't matter if peace was possible. What mattered was the response. In a world where memory outlived justice, letting a wound heal too early was worse than making it deeper. Yet, despite this, Vikings also had strong family values. Fathers raised sons in the art of war, yes, but also taught poetry, navigation, and law. They built homes with care, shared stories by firelight, and buried their loved ones with intricate rites. They believed in fate but also in legacy. So how do we reconcile this? How do we understand a people who burned cities but composed verses to the moon, who sailed thousands of miles to raid, but wept when their comrades fell? We understand them, not as monsters or heroes but as paradoxes. Their honor was savage because it had to be. Their world was harsh, their winters brutal, their survival hard-won. To be soft was to die, but to live without rules, that was not Viking either. Their sagas preserved attention. They didn't romanticize suffering, but they respected its necessity. A great warrior could be mourned and feared in the same tale. His death could be both tragic and glorious. His deeds could bring peace through war. That's the strange poetry of the Viking spirit, and even now, centuries later, we still wrestle with that paradox. In every culture that reveres its past warriors, in every story that tries to define just violence, echoes of their code remain. We still admire the fearless, we still debate what makes power moral. We still tell stories where the sword is both hero and villain, because maybe, in every age, some honors must be earned with blood, and maybe, just maybe, some savagery comes with a crown. There is no screaming, no roaring waves or thunderous drums, only the gentle hush of water brushing against a wooden hull. A white sail moves silently across the morning sea, casting its shadow on the monastery walls before a single prayer can be finished. By the time the monks look up from their scriptures, it's already too late. The Vikings have landed, the raid has begun, but it isn't what you'd expect. No chaos, no fury, No bloodlust in the air, just cold efficiency. They move like shadows, like a tide that doesn't crash but swallows. There are no wasted movements, no shouts of conquest. Only the precise taking of what they came for: silver, gold, relics, supplies, and sometimes people. And then, just as quickly, they vanished. This is the paradox of the peaceful raider violent act carried out with such calm, it almost feels like order. The world remembers the Vikings as berserkers, driven by rage and madness. And yes, those existed, but many of their most effective raids were terrifying because they lacked chaos. They were planned, timed, and executed with discipline that rivaled professional armies. What made them truly frightening wasn't their brutality, it was their control. Take Lindisfarne in 793 AD, often marked as the beginning of the Viking Age. It wasn't a random explosion of violence. The monastery held religious significance, yes, but more importantly, it held wealth. Gold crosses, jeweled chalices, manuscripts easily transported, high-value goods. The Vikings weren't raiding to make a statement, they were raiding for profit, and they knew exactly where to find it, and so they arrived not like wild animals, but like traders who had decided negotiation was no longer necessary. They bypassed castles and cities in favor of undefended targets. They studied trade routes, they timed attacks to local religious festivals or times of low tide, knowing the people would be distracted or unable to flee. The raid became less of a battle and more of a harvest. That's what made it peaceful in the most unsettling sense. Peaceful not in its result but in its design. Cold, clean, intentional. Even their exit was calculated. Longships were built not just for speed, but for shallow waters. A Viking could land directly on the beach, raid the settlement, and be gone again before a local militia could even be mustered. For the victims, it felt like a dream or a nightmare too precise to be real. Then the paradox deepens. In many cases, these raiders would later return to the same regions as settlers. They built towns, married local women, traded openly. Some even converted to Christianity. The same men who once raided a church might later kneel in one. In Dublin, York, and Normandy, the descendants of those raiders became kings and nobles. Their rule was not just tolerated, it was welcomed. The once feared Vikings became protectors, even lords. In some cases, entire regions paid Danegeld tribute to avoid being raided again, and the Vikings took the money, not as extortionists but as businessmen. Why risk bloodshed when you could be paid not to fight? That's the unsettling core of this paradox. A raid didn't have to be violent to succeed. Sometimes, the memory of past violence was enough. Fear became a currency, and silence became a weapon. The peaceful raid is not about kindness. It is about knowing when violence is unnecessary because power has already been established. It's the kind of raid that leaves no scars on the land, only on the psyche. You never heard them coming. You never saw their faces. But you remembered the silence, and yet, in the middle of all this, the Vikings weren't mindless. They wrote poetry. They carried gods on carved amulets. They had laws, rituals, stories. Some victims described them as courteous, even generous. Once the looting was over, a monk might be spared if he cooperated. A village might be left untouched if it had already paid. They weren't raiders out of chaos. They were raiders out of strategy. And the more you learn about them, the more this paradox expands, because the peaceful raid tells us something larger. That violence does not always need rage. That history's wildest invasions may not have shouted. They may have whispered. The Viking didn't need to break the door if the lock had already rusted from fear. He just needed to walk in and take what was already his. A man kneels before a stone altar in the dark, his head bowed in reverence, but the prayer on his lips is not Latin, it's Old Norse, and the gods he worships do not promise peace or salvation. They demand courage, sacrifice, blood. This is a temple without walls, a religion without mercy. Welcome to the paradox of the holy heathens, a people both godless and deeply devout. To the Christian monks who first encountered them, the Vikings were soulless beasts. They pillaged churches, slaughtered priests, mocked sacred relics. What kind of man burns a monastery and then carves runes of thanks to his own gods in the ashes? But this was not godlessness. This was a different form of worship, fierce, raw, and entirely incompatible with the Christian world. The Vikings were deeply religious. Their lives were structured around myth, ritual, and fate. They believed in the Norns who spun their destinies, in Odin who traded an eye for wisdom, in Thor who guarded Midgard with thunder. These weren't just stories, they were truths, lived and died by. But here's the paradox. While the Christian world built towering cathedrals and wrote scriptures on gold-leafed vellum. The Vikings painted their beliefs in blood and fire. They made offerings not with hymns, but with blades. A battlefield was their altar. A warrior's last breath was his final prayer. And yet, there was something sacred in their violence. A raid wasn't just theft. It was a test of courage, a sacrifice to the gods. When a Viking died with a weapon in his hand, he didn't fear damnation. He hoped for Valhalla warriors' paradise of endless feasting and battle. For them, this wasn't brutality. It was destiny fulfilled. Christian chroniclers couldn't understand it. They wrote of demons and beasts from the north, never grasping that these barbarians believed in a divine order just as passionately as any monk. The problem wasn't godlessness, it was theological conflict. One man's blasphemy was another's holiness, and the paradox didn't stop there. In time, many Vikings did convert. Kings like Harald Bluetooth and Olaf Tryggvason embraced Christianity out of shame, but strategy. Christianity offered structure, legitimacy, alliances. But even in conversion, the old gods lingered. Viking crosses were often adorned with dragon heads. Churches were built on sacred groves. The faith may have changed, but the soul remained divided. Some Viking warriors were buried with both a crucifix and a Thor's hammer hedging their bets between two heavens. That image of a man buried with symbols from opposing worlds, the heart of this paradox. Holy, yet heathen, devout, yet damned. Even their laws reflected a spiritual complexity. Blasphemy against the chieftains, God could bring exile or death. Runes were carved with ritual precision. Burial rites were elaborate, honoring both the body and the unseen spirits that guided the journey to the afterlife. There was structure, belief, reverence. It just didn't look like what their enemies expected. And so, the paradox endures. A civilization condemned as godless, yet built on myth and faith. A people who set fire to churches, but only to light the way for their own gods. Holy heathens, both feared and misunderstood. Because sometimes, the difference between a prophet and a pagan is only the language of the prayer. And sometimes, holiness wears a horned helm. The ocean was never still in a Viking's mind. Even when they stood on solid ground, the waves pulled at their bones, whispering of distant lands and unclaimed shores. They were settlers, yes, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, but always, there was movement. Always, there was the sea. The paradox of the endless voyage is that even when they stopped, they never truly arrived. A Viking journey didn't end at a destination, it became the destination. From the icy coasts of Norway to the rivers of Russia, from the green hills of Ireland to the sunlit shores of Sicily, they went not to escape, but to expand. To leave behind a piece of themselves in every place they touched, yet never feel truly rooted in any of them. What drove them was not always conquest. Sometimes it was curiosity, hunger, dreams, the promise that something better, richer, freer, more worthy lay just beyond the horizon. And so they went, over and over again. Raiding, trading, building, abandoning, restless souls in ships carved with dragons. But this voyage was not just physical, it was spiritual. Vikings believed life itself was a journey, a test against fate. And the elements, the sea was not an obstacle, it was a proving ground. A place to become more than a man. The long ship was not just a vessel, it was a coffin, a cradle, a throne. It held the weight of dreams and the promise of death. They buried their chieftains in ships, as if to say, the voyage doesn't end here. It goes on into other worlds, through gates of mist and shadow, to Valhalla, to hell, to wherever the gods chose to send them. To be a Viking was to accept that the journey is eternal and that the sea never gives answers, only more directions, and so they wandered, but not aimlessly. Iceland was born of this paradox, a barren island transformed into a poetic stronghold. Greenland too was misnamed on purpose, just to lure others westward, and then came Vinland, the strange and distant edge of the world north. America touched centuries before Columbus ever sailed, but no matter how far they went, they didn't plant roots the way others did. They built outposts, not empires. They left runestones, not monuments. They whispered stories into the wind and moved on. That is the contradiction. They spread their legacy across continents, yet held no loyalty to land. Even their gods were travelers. Odin rode across realms, Thor crossed the skies, Loki slipped between worlds, and the sagas are filled with voyages, heroic, tragic, absurd, always chasing something just out of reach. And perhaps that was the point. The endless voyage was not about arriving, it was about becoming. Every raid changed them, every trade taught them, every storm sharpened their soul. In constant motion, they found their meaning, and in the endlessness, they became legend. Even now, their names echo across maps: Dublin, Normandy, Kiev, traces of their passage, like the wake of a ship that's already vanished into the fog. So, the question remains, did the Vikings ever truly arrive anywhere? Or did they simply teach us that some journeys were never meant to end? Because in their world, to stop was to die, but to sail was to live forever. Every Viking dreamed of glory, to die with a blade in hand, to have their names sung in mead halls long after their bones had turned to dust. Glory wasn't a hope, it was a duty, a fire that burned in their chest from the moment they could lift a wooden sword. But here lies the paradox of the glory's burden. What was supposed to be their highest achievement was also their heaviest curse. Glory demanded sacrifice, not just of blood, but of peace, family, comfort, and even one's own soul. A warrior chasing eternal fame couldn't afford hesitation, couldn't weep at loss, couldn't stop to ask whether it was all worth it. To be remembered, you had to become a storm, and storms don't mourn. A Viking might rise to legend by leading a daring raid or slaying a rival Jarl. But what did he lose to get there? A brother who bled out beside him, a wife left waiting at the shore, a childhood friend turned enemy over pride. These were the hidden costs carved into every ballad, and the burden didn't end in death. The sagas tell us that even in Valhalla, warriors fight every day, slashing and dying and rising again. Paradise, for a Viking, was not rest, it was endless war. That was the reward, and the punishment. So they trained their sons from boyhood. Be fierce, be fearless, die with honor. But deep down, many must have known what they were passing on was a curse. Because glory doesn't share space with mercy, and fame does not remember the kind. Even Viking kings felt the weight. Harald Hardrada, the Thunder of Norway, spent his life chasing triumph. He fought across Byzantium, claimed kingdoms, bathed in the blood of enemies, and died trying to take England, his body broken on a battlefield far from home. Glorious, yes, but also tragic. His name lived on, but his life was swallowed by ambition. And what of those who didn't seek glory? The farmers, the weavers, the storytellers. They were the spine of Norse society, yet their names were forgotten, their lives unsung. In a culture obsessed with legend, being ordinary felt like a quiet form of erasure. You were either myth or nothing. This was the cruel weight of the Viking soul. To be remembered, you had to burn bright, and burning always leaves ashes. Even the skalds, the poets who shaped memory itself, carried this paradox. They turned men into legends, but they also knew the truth beneath the verses. They saw the hollow eyes behind the helmets, the ghosts that walked even before death. But still, they wrote, because the culture demanded it. Glory was currency, but it was earned in suffering. And so, generation after generation, the burden was passed down. Sons avenged fathers, husbands sought revenge, villagers sent boys to die, so they might sing of their courage, all in service of something no one could hold in their hands, legacy. So when we admire the Vikings for their fearlessness, we must also see the cost, the grief that never made it into the sagas, the burden that came with every chant of a name, because in their world, glory was the highest light, and also the darkest shadow. The words were simple, spoken in the glow of firelight, sealed with a clasp of arms or the prick of a blade, but once made, they bound more tightly than chains. A Viking oath wasn't just a promise, it was a curse in waiting, because the paradox of the blood oath lies in its sacred weight. The deeper the loyalty, the greater the ruin when it's broken. In Viking society, honor wasn't protected by laws, it was maintained through oaths, swearing fealty to a jarl, promising vengeance for a fallen kin, pledging silence about a raid's true spoils. All these were kept alive by blood and belief, and once made, they could not be undone without consequence. To break an oath was not merely shameful, it was soul-destroying. A man who betrayed a vow might find himself declared uningray, a term worse than outlaw. It meant you were lower than a coward, dishonored, cursed, cast out not only from your community but from the memory of your ancestors. No greater punishment existed in the Viking mind, and yet not all oaths led to glory. Many led to ruin. Two warriors might swear brotherhood, only to find themselves ordered to kill one another in feuds of family loyalty. A jarl might demand a blood price that forced his most faithful retainer to burn down a home he once swore to protect. A man might vow to defend his king, then watch that king descend into madness. And still, the oath held. Vikings knew this. They told stories of men torn apart not by war, but by conflicting vows, because once an oath was made, there was no escape. no loophole. To live meant to follow through even if it cost you your soul. The paradox grew sharper in the heat of vengeance. Blood feuds were not spontaneous, they were systematized, ritualized. If a father was killed, his son must avenge him, not for justice, but for the oath. It didn't matter how many years had passed. The chain could stretch across generations. Entire families wiped out, not because they wanted war but because an ancestor had once spoken a vow they could no longer ignore. And the most terrifying part, sometimes those who kept their oaths suffered more than those who broke them. Imagine the man who carries out vengeance as promised only to live with the guilt forever, or the warrior who stays loyal to a doomed expedition, sailing into certain death because he gave his word. These are not heroic tales with clean endings. These are sagas stained with regret, with men dying not as villains, but as prisoners of their own honor. There were no easy exits. Even gods weren't free from this paradox. Odin himself swore oaths that brought about Ragnarok, the end of the world. He made sacrifices for knowledge, for fate, for power, but in doing so, he sowed his own destruction. Loki, once a blood brother to Odin, turned traitor, but his betrayal was rooted in oaths made and twisted, truths half kept and half broken. The gods bled from the same paradox that haunted mortals, the binding power of words. That's the Viking view of reality, not a place of forgiveness, but of consequence. Yet despite the dangers, oaths were not feared, they were revered. A man without oaths was a man without weight, without meaning, a leaf blown by the wind. But a man with oaths, no matter how heavy, was grounded, respected, even envied, because an oath gave shape to life. It told you who you were, what you stood for, what you'd die for, and in a world ruled by chaos, that was something close to control. It's no wonder they swore so often before battles, during feasts, beside corpses, under stars. They believed that to speak was to carve a path in fate, and once carved, you walked it, no matter how sharp the stones beneath your feet. So when we hear tales of Viking loyalty, we should remember the weight that loyalty carried. It wasn't noble in the modern sense, it was brutal, beautiful, and often unbearably tragic. That is the blood oath. A bond deeper than friendship, stronger than reason, older than mercy, and once sealed, it echoes louder than the blade, because sometimes the promise kills before the enemy does. The village is silent now, only smoke curling into the sky, only crows left to sing. But the strange thing is not that the Vikings came, it's how they came. They spared the children, they left food behind, they allowed the priest to flee. The rest, dead, burned, gone, and still, survivors whispered that these raiders had shown mercy. This is the paradox of the merciful slaughter, where destruction is wrapped in restraint, where killers believe they've done something kind. To modern ears, it sounds grotesque. How can slaughter ever be merciful? But to the Viking mind, it wasn't so simple. They believed in calculated violence, in rules of and in chaos, and sometimes that meant offering mercy not to stop the blood, but to control the story left behind. When Vikings raided a settlement, they made choices. Not all acts were fueled by rage or greed. A chieftain might command that women and children be spared, not out of compassion, but strategy. Sparing them sent a message: we could have destroyed everything, but we didn't. It preserved the illusion of order, even in horror. It brought fear, respect, and compliance in future raids. It also preserved reputation. Vikings cared deeply about how they were remembered. Stories spread faster than ships. If a village told of raiders who spared the innocent, future communities might surrender without resistance. This wasn't kindness, it was a weapon, a strange diplomacy carved through flesh. But sometimes, it was kindness, or something like it. Raiders were human. They saw children clutching their mothers, heard prayers spoken in trembling voices, and in those moments, some made choices that defied command. Not all mercy was strategy. Some was simply the refusal to go further. There are recorded accounts of monks who were spared because of their songs, of families allowed to live because a Viking warrior remembered his own home. These moments did not erase the violence, but they complicated it. That's what makes it a paradox. Mercy inside massacre, humanity inside horror, and the contradiction runs deeper. To the Vikings, dying in battle was honorable, but killing an unarmed man that could bring shame. So when they chose to slaughter, it was done with intent, with reason. A leader might order death only after an insult. A traitor might spare a rival if he begged well enough. There was, in their own terms, a moral structure within the madness. Even their treatment of prisoners showed this complexity. Some were ransomed and returned. Others were enslaved but well-fed, trained, even adopted into Viking households. A few became warriors themselves. Again, it wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't senseless either. It was rule-bound cruelty. This pattern echoed in Viking law codes. Blood vengeance was legal but only to a point. Killed too recklessly, and you risked outlawry. There were limits to wrath, even among the fiercest. Consider the tale of Ragnar. Lothbrake's legendary raids were brutal, yet he's remembered as a cunning, even charismatic figure. He spared kings when it suited him, made alliances with former enemies. Even in death cast into a pit of snakes he is said to have laughed, accepting his fate with pride. His sons, in turn, avenged him with fire and fury, but not without pause. They gave enemies a chance to convert, offered them choices, and when those were refused only then came slaughter. Was that mercy, or just a formality before the blade? Either way, it shaped how they saw themselves. Vikings weren't mindless butchers. They believed they were executing justice, fulfilling fate, balancing chaos with control. And mercy, however rare, was part of that equation. A tool, a truth, a torment. The paradox persists in how we remember them. We see their axes, their flames, their conquests, but we also see moments of restraint. The spared villager who lived to tell the tale, the prayer answered by a glance, not a cut. These are not stories of heroes, but they are stories of complexity. Because sometimes, the deepest terror is not in total destruction, but in knowing the destruction could have been worse, that what you called survival was someone else's mercy, and that mercy, too, carries a scar. The wind carries the scent of salt and smoke as the longship cuts through the waves. The warriors aboard it are laughing, singing, sharpening their blades. They believe they are free wild souls, untethered by king or priest, living by the strength of their arms and the will of their gods. But beneath their freedom lies something deeper, something unbreakable, fate. And that is the paradox of fated freedom: to live as if you choose your path, while believing it has already been carved into the bones of the world. To a Viking, freedom was sacred. It meant the right to sail where you pleased, to fight for your name, to die without begging. No emperor or god was meant to dictate your will. A man could rise from nothing and earn his place through courage and cunning. A slave might win his freedom. A farmer might become a war chief. The social order was not set in stone, it shifted, like the tide. But freedom in the Viking world came with a strange shadow, word, or fate. The Norns, three mythical sisters, were believed to spin, measure, and cut the thread of every life. No matter how fierce or free you were, your ending had already been decided. You didn't escape fate, you fulfilled it. You could run across oceans, but you'd never outrun your thread. So what was freedom, really? A man might charge into battle, thinking he made the choice, but in his mind, the outcome was already written. If he died, it was because he was meant to. If he lived, it was because the gods still had use for him. Bravery wasn't about beating fate, it was about facing it without flinching. That belief created a peculiar kind of courage. Vikings didn't see risk the way others did. A storm at sea, if it was their time to drown, so be it. A king's fury, if they were meant to die by his blade, nothing could change it. This wasn't recklessness, it was surrender with pride, and yet they still acted with intense will. They made plans, swore oaths, sought revenge, loved deeply, fought furiously. They lived like men who believed in choice, even as they claimed to believe in destiny. This paradox made their culture both fearless and fatalistic. It allowed for immense personal power, but also profound resignation. A man could kill without hesitation, knowing it was fate's hand guiding the sword. A widow could accept her husband's death, believing his time had simply come. It made suffering seem sacred, and victory seem inevitable. But it also brought pain. Imagine believing that your child's death was not an accident, but a necessity. That your failures weren't your fault, but your fate. That no matter how hard you tried, the thread would snap when the Norns decided, and not a heartbeat sooner. Men rebelled against this quietly. They consulted seers, changed names to fool the gods, wore protective charms. But deep down, even those who questioned fate still honored it. They just hoped to negotiate with it. The sagas reflect this tension. Heroes like Sigurd the Dragonslayer or Brynhild the Valkyrie are powerful, proud, and free-willed, but every step they take leads them to a destiny they cannot avoid. Their downfall is not caused by weakness, but by fate's design. The tragedy is not in their choices, but in how little their choices ultimately mattered. And yet, the Vikings still believed freedom was worth having, even if it was only an illusion, because how you walked toward your fate mattered more than where it led. Were you laughing? Were you armed? Were you singing your own death song? That was freedom enough. In modern times we like to think freedom and fate are opposites, but the Vikings saw them as partners in a dance. Fate told you when, freedom decided how. So they lived wildly, sailed far, fought hard not to escape fate, but to honor it, because to them, a short glorious life was better than a long meaningless one, and freedom, even if it was fated, still felt like flight. The torch hits the roof and flame blooms like a second sun. The snow beneath it melts in droplets, then steams. Screams echo across the frozen field as heat clashes with ice, fire consuming what cold could not protect. This is the paradox of burning cold, a world where frost and flame lived side by side, not as opposites, but as partners in the brutality of Viking life. The Viking world was defined by cold, not just the weather, but the way of life. Harsh, unforgiving, endless. Winters weren't seasons, they were battles. Food grew scarce, light grew thin, and silence became a kind of predator. You didn't survive the cold, you endured it. And to endure it, you had to become just as merciless. But inside that cold, there was always fire. In hearths, in hearts, in raids. Fire was survival. Fire was a weapon. Fire was life. And so the coldest people often wielded the hottest fury. This duality shaped everything about them. A Viking home was a fortress against winter, built low to trap heat. The family would huddle around a single hearth in the long dark months, telling stories of gods and monsters, death and rebirth. Fire gave light, warmth, memory. It was sacred. It was trusted. But the same fire was also used to destroy in raids. Vikings burned monasteries, towns, barns. Fire was not just for warmth, was for fear. To see your village consumed by flame in the dead of winter was a horror few could survive. The cold alone could kill you, but the fire made sure your name never rose again. And this is where the paradox grows darker. For the Vikings, fire wasn't only destruction, it was a message, a declaration. A raid without fire might be seen as weakness, but a raid that left nothing but ash, that was power. Fire was the punctuation at the end of every conquest. It didn't just kill, it erased. Yet, back home, fire was protection. A woman would feed the hearth as though it were a living god. A child would be taught never to let the flame go out, even if it meant burning the last piece of driftwood. The same flame that devoured foreign homes was treated with tenderness at home. They lived in this contradiction every day. Warmth inside, ice outside, kindness at the hearth, cruelty at the coast. The mythology reinforced this. In Norse cosmology, the world was born from the collision of fire and ice, Muspelheim and Niv. From that tension came all life, all matter, all gods. Even the end of the world, Ragnarok, was foretold as a burning winter. Flames that would consume the sky, frost that would crack the earth. The final war would not be between good and evil, but between heat and cold, both necessary, both deadly. So when Vikings brought fire to a snowy village, they were not just conquering, they were echoing creation, reenacting the old myths, living inside the primal war of elements that their entire worldview was built upon. And there's something poetic about that to outsiders. They seemed mad, burning what they could use, destroying what could feed them. But to them, it wasn't madness, it was purification. Cold was the test. Fire was the reward. This dual nature made them unpredictable. You never knew if a Viking warband would torch your home or shelter in it, if they would offer warmth or bring fire. Both outcomes came from the same men, the same culture, and they believed both were justified. Even in death, this paradox remained. A fallen warrior might be cremated on a blazing ship, fire carrying him into the afterlife. But others were buried beneath stone mounds, frozen into the soil. One path through fire, one through ice, each sacred, each final dot. So what do we make of this? The Viking soul was not torn between opposites, it embraced them. It understood that to survive the cold, you needed fire, and to wield fire properly, you needed the cold to measure its worth. That's why they could be so tender in their homes and so savage in their wars. Why they could build and burn in the same breath, because they were children of frost and flame. And sometimes the coldest hearts burn the brightest. The battlefield is still, not quiet still, the kind of silence that feels like it's listening. A Viking warrior stands with his axe at the ready, eyes locked on the enemy, but he doesn't scream, he doesn't chant, he doesn't shout his name into the wind like the sagas say he should. Instead, he waits calm, focused, silent. This is the paradox of the silent warrior, people known for their roaring fury, who found their deadliest power not in noise, but in silence. We imagine Vikings as wild berserkers, foaming at the mouth, charging into battle with guttural screams and the pounding of shields. And often they were, but not always. In reality, some of the most feared warriors were the ones who said nothing, who moved like shadows, who didn't need to make noise to announce death's arrival, because true terror doesn't always come with sound. A silent warrior was one who had mastered his fear. He didn't need to scream to summon courage, he was courage. His silence wasn't hesitation, it was focus, it was control. And in the Viking world, control over yourself was one of the highest marks of power. Imagine being an enemy on the other side of that line. You're bracing for a wave of howls, but instead, the warriors just stand there, unmoving, unreadable. No threats, no taunts, just the cold stare of someone who's already decided how this ends. It's not just unnerving, it paralyzing. The paradox deepens when we realize that Vikings didn't just use silence in battle, they respected it in life. The Thing, their public assembly, was often a place of loud debate, but when warriors spoke, they chose their words carefully. A boast that went too far, a word spoken in anger, could cost you your life. In a world ruled by honor, silence wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. In sagas, silence is a powerful tool. The greatest heroes don't talk endlessly about their strength, they prove it. A man who talks too much is often marked as doomed. A man of few words, on the other hand, is watched carefully. He carries mystery, uncertainty, threat. Odin, the All-Father, was the god of wisdom and war. He prized silence when it came with knowledge. He listened more than he spoke. He traveled in disguise, observing, judging. Even his ravens Hugin and Munin were named thought and memory, not shout and roar. The Berserkers, famed for their uncontrollable rage, were often matched by Ulfredna wolf warriors who hunted in silence, wearing wolf pelts and moving in coordinated silence, striking with precision. Their quiet wasn't passive, it was predatory. There's also the silence after the strike. Vikings didn't linger after killing. They moved on, clean, efficient. The battle was the means, not the song. They didn't always need to celebrate a kill. For many, silence was the truest form of respect for the fallen enemy or kin. Even in mourning, silence was a form of expression. Grief was not always loud. The widows staring at the sea, the sun lighting the funeral pyre. No screams, just a flame in the cold. The dead were honored through presence, not performance. And yet, when Vikings did choose to scream, it meant something. It wasn't constant, it was ritual. A Warcry was used to open the gate, to cross a threshold, to declare a storm. But the silence that followed, that was the real danger. Because a scream announces intention, but silence hides certainty. Modern myths confuse volume with power, but the Vikings knew better. They understood that sometimes the loudest man is the least prepared, that real danger doesn't need to speak. It acts. And they lived in a world where sound could betray you. On a raid, stealth mattered. Silence meant survival. The crunch of a boot too soon, the whisper of metal any of it, could doom the mission. Their deadliest skill was knowing when not to speak. So the paradox holds. A culture known for thunder was also shaped by silence. In the moments before a clash, in the hush of snowfall on a bloodied field, in the look shared between warriors who know only one will walk away. A Warcry may start the battle, but silence ends it, and sometimes the truest sound of fear is hearing nothing at all. The man stands at the edge of the world. Behind him, the village he conquered lies smoldering. Ahead, the ocean stretches into an uncertain future. His name has been carved into the stones of foreign lands. His enemies lie buried beneath banners. He once feared, by every measure he has one, and yet he does not smile, he does not sing, he does not feel victorious. This is the paradox of the lost conqueror, the warrior who gains everything he sought, only to find that the conquest has taken more than it gave. To the Vikings, conquest was the highest pursuit. Raiding, claiming land, forcing kings to bend the knees were not just acts of power, but proof of divine favor. A successful warrior was seen as chosen, blessed by fate and feared by men. The world opened up to him. Gold, glory, stories, sung in halls long after his bones turned to dust. But what those stories rarely told was what the conqueror lost along the way. The hunger for victory devoured everything else. Friendships became weapons, love became distraction, family became names whispered at night when no one else could hear. Conquerors became ghosts in their own sagas, known by others, but never truly known themselves. And often, they kept going, not because they needed more land, but because they didn't know how to stop. Stopping meant facing what they'd become. Stopping meant silence. And silence, to a man built on war, was the one thing more terrifying than death. Take Ivar the Boneless, feared across kingdoms, a tactician, a monster, a legend. But even the stories admit his victories left him hollow. His rage was unending, his enemies countless. He carved his name into history but never found peace. Or consider the nameless Viking warbands, who traveled farther than any imagined into Russia, Byzantium, perhaps even North America. They left no trace of home, no hearth to return to. Their lives were movement, conflict, expansion. And when they stopped, they vanished it into death, but into forgetting. That's the tragedy. You can conquer the world and still lose yourself. The sagas even hint at this. The greatest heroes are often the loneliest. The most victorious are the most cursed. Power isolates. Fame turns faces into masks. A conqueror is admired by many, but truly understood by none. And sometimes, what is conquered isn't even worth keeping. A raided village might yield gold, but the people are gone. The homes are ash. A captured territory might bring prestige, but ruling, it means constant fear of rebellion, resentment, betrayal. The war is over, but the fight never ends. And the conqueror, once wild and free, becomes a prisoner of the very thing he claimed. Some tried to escape this fate by settling, by becoming kings, governors, landowners, but even then the sword never left their hand. Peace to a Viking who had built his life on chaos felt unnatural. Rest was a battlefield of a different kind, one without rules or glory. Even their mythology warned of this. Odin, the god of war and wisdom, never stopped seeking, never rested, always wandered. His victories only led to more questions, more sacrifices. He was the wisest of the gods, and also the most tormented. The paradox is not that conquest fails, it's that it succeeds but only in taking. It gives a name, a legacy, a tale, but it strips away the person beneath it. So the conqueror wins, but loses his laughter, his home, his soul. In the end, he stands alone, crowned in silence, because some men don't die in battle, they die in victory. The hall is warm with fire and laughter. Horns of mead are raised. Oaths are toasted, hands clasped, songs sung beneath carved wooden beams. And yet, across the flickering shadows, two men exchange a glance that means the end of everything. The betrayal is not loud, it is sacred, inevitable, ancient. This is the paradox of the sacred betrayal, where betrayal isn't a failure of honor, but a fulfillment of it. In Viking culture, loyalty was everything. You swore fealty to your jarl, blood oaths to your brothers, vengeance vows to your ancestors. To betray someone was considered the gravest of sins, and yet, it happened constantly. Not out of weakness, but out of duty, out of necessity, because sometimes, to stay loyal to one vow meant breaking another. A warrior might swear to protect his brother, but also to avenge his father who was murdered by that same brother. A jarl might promise peace to a rival clan, then be forced to strike first to prevent his own people's extinction. A son might be raised by the man who killed his real father, and when the truth emerges, the son must choose between love and legacy. These weren't just tragedies, they were rituals. The Norse sagas are full of such betrayals. Not random, not selfish, but sacred. Chosen because not choosing would dishonor. Something even older than the oath. One of the most famous examples is the tale of Sigurd and Brynhild. A love story turned blood feud. Oaths are sworn, identities mistaken, truths hidden. When the betrayal comes, it isn't just personal, it's mythic. The gods themselves seem to demand it. Love is sacrificed to vengeance, friendship to fate. No one escapes clean. And yet, everyone believes they did the right thing. That's the heart of this paradox. Betrayal was despised in word but understood in spirit. A man who broke his oath might still be mourned, remembered, even honored, because everyone knew, in a world with too many loyalties, someone would always be betrayed. And the gods were no better. Odin, the Allfather, betrayed countless beings in his quest for knowledge and power. He promised peace, then unleashed war. Loki, his blood brother, betrayed the gods at Ragnarok, but only after being bound, humiliated, cast out. Was he wrong, or simply playing his part? Even the creation of the world came from betrayal. The gods murdered Ymir, the primordial giant, and built the universe from his body. Sacred blood was always spilled first. Betrayal, in this sense, was the engine of transformation. It shattered old orders, it forced decisions, it revealed truth, and it was always personal. A Viking could forgive a stolen sheep, but a broken oath, a poisoned friendship that burned through generations. Entire blood feuds began with one sacred betrayal, and no one involved ever truly believed they were in the wrong. That's what made it sacred, because it wasn't treachery for gain, it was sacrifice for principle. You didn't betray to escape your duty, you betrayed because of it. Imagine a young warrior raised beside a foster brother, closer than blood, but his real father was murdered by that foster brother's clan. When he comes of age, he learns that truth, Now, what does he do? Remain loyal to the brother who saved his life, or kill him to honor the ghost of a father he never knew? Whichever he chooses, he betrays someone, and whichever path he walks, he believes he is doing what's right. That is the sacred betrayal, not a failure of honor, but its most painful fulfillment. The silence after such betrayals was often deeper than the act itself. There were no victory songs, no toasts, just exile, grief, the understanding that something irreversible had been done, and that both sides carried the wound. But the memory remained, and in that memory, the betrayed and the betrayer became legends, because they were flawless, but because they revealed how deeply loyalty could be tested. In a world where every choice binds you tighter, betrayal was sometimes the only way forward, because to be truly loyal, you sometimes had to choose who you would betray. The longhouse roars with celebration, meat sizzles over the fire, horns spill mead onto fur-lined cloaks, tables groan beneath heaps of roasted boar, salted fish, wheels of cheese, and baked bread. Men sing, women laugh, children run between legs with sticky fingers. It feels like the gods themselves have come down to join the feast, and yet just weeks ago, this same village was starving, bellies hollow, smoke curling from empty pots, and next week hunger will return. This is the paradox of the Feast of Famine, where abundance and deprivation are never far apart, and survival swings wildly between excess and emptiness. In the Viking world, life came in bursts. A successful raid, a good harvest, or a generous trade could fill a community with sudden riches. But those riches rarely lasted. The north was harsh. Winters were long and unpredictable. Crops failed, livestock died, trade routes closed, and so when food appeared, it wasn't saved, it was celebrated. To hoard was shameful, to feast was human. You didn't know when the next meal would come, so you honored the present one like it was your last. But this attitude created a strange rhythm to Viking life. A village might suffer through weeks of thin gruel and dried seaweed only to erupt in days of mead and meat after a successful raid. Bones still sore from labor, they'd drink until the ground spun, eat until their guts ached, give thanks to the gods, and collapse by the hearth. And then, slowly, the feast would fade. The mead ran low, the meat turned sour, the laughter quieted, hunger crept back in. The feast, in this way, became a ritual of defiance, not just against scarcity but against fear. To feast in the face of famine was to say, you may come again, hunger, but tonight, you do not win. This paradox extended beyond food. It was reflected in the Viking soul itself. These were people who lived intensely not because they were reckless, but because they understood fragility. Life could be taken by storm, blade, or illness at any moment. So when joy came, it was embraced without hesitation. There was no moderation. When they loved fiercely. When they mourned, they wailed. When they sang, the echoes reached the sea, and when they feasted, they feasted. But this rhythm had consequences. Some Viking leaders, desperate to maintain the image of abundance, would stage feasts they couldn't afford. Gold from a raid was spent on ale and prestige, not long-term security. Meat that could have been dried for winter was roasted for one wild night. And when the frost came, there was nothing left. That's the darker side of the paradox. The feast is glorious, but it can hasten the famine. It creates loyalty, but also dependency. It offers warmth, but blinds people to the cold that follows. A chieftain known for great feasts might rise in status only to fall when his hall goes quiet. The people who praised him in joy might abandon him in hunger. Even in mythology, this pattern appears. The gods themselves are shown feasting endlessly. In Valhalla, mead flowing from magical goats, a boar resurrected each day for roasting. But beneath the revelry is the knowledge that Ragnarok is coming. The end will not be delayed by meat and meat. The gods feast because they know it is temporary. That's the truth the Vikings understood too well. Pleasure is fleeting. Hunger always returns. And yet, they chose the feast anyway. Because to deny joy in a world of suffering was to let death win too early. So they raised their horns. They tore meat with their hands. They fed their neighbors even when there wasn't enough to go around, because they believed generosity mattered more than preservation. That sharing now was better than starving together later in the longhouse, where songs echoed off timber and fire danced on the faces of warriors. The paradox took full shape. They were not fools, they were realists. And their realism said, this will not last, so let us honor it now. Feast and famine, joy and fear, survival and celebration. To live like a Viking was to stand between those poles and dance while there was still music. Because the feast was never just about food, it was about proving, even for one night, but life was still theirs to devour. The mountain looms white and ancient, its slopes glazed in ice so thick it hums with silence. Below it, deep beneath the permafrost, a volcanic tremor stirs. Fire beneath ice, a sleeping storm under a frozen sky. This is no fantasy, this is Iceland, a land where glaciers crown volcanoes, where boiling geysers erupt through fields of snow, and where people, hardened by both flame and frost, learn to call such contradictions home. This is the paradox of the frozen fire world, where opposites do not cancel each other out, but coexist violently, beautifully, inevitably. When the Vikings first settled Iceland around 870 CE, they found a land that made no sense. Lava fields stretched into ice deserts, fumaroles hissed under snowbanks, ash fell from the sky even as rivers froze. It was as if the gods had thrown creation's leftovers into one place, half inferno, half tundra, and the Vikings did not just survive there, they thrived. But to live on a land that was both burning and frozen required a new kind of thinking, a new kind of spirit. It wasn't enough to fear the elements, you had to understand their language. The volcano that destroyed your grazing land might, years later, leave behind fertile soil richer than any field in Norway. The glacier that crushed your path might feed the river you used to power your mill. Nothing was entirely bad. Nothing was purely good. The fire and ice shaped not only the land, but the people. Vikings who lived in Iceland became poets, lawmakers, mystics. They watched the earth split open with flame and didn't run, they wrote it down. They carved law stones beside geysers. They debated clan vengeance in lava caves, and from this frozen fire came one of the greatest literary traditions in medieval Europe, the Icelandic sagas. These were not just stories. They were the soul of a people tempered by extremes. Heroes in the sagas often mirror the land itself, cold on the outside, smoldering with passion underneath. Men who spoke in riddles and silences, but acted with sudden, shocking intensity. Women who appeared calm as snow until they burned down homes in the name of honor. Like their land, they were not stable but balanced on the edge of instability. Even their justice system reflected this balance. Iceland had no king, only a shared parliament, the Althing, one of the oldest surviving parliaments in the world. It met once a year, beneath an open sky, where boiling springs and basalt cliffs echoed every word. Disputes were settled not through centralized power, but communal judgment, law-tempered violence, fire-tempered frost, and yet revenge still flowed like lava beneath the surface. Feuds erupted, blood debts were paid in silence and steel. Like the land, peace was never permanent, but neither was chaos. The Vikings of Iceland came to understand something many societies forget. True stability isn't the absence of opposites, it's learning to live with them in constant tension. They built turf houses into the sides of frozen hills. They bathed in hot springs while snow fell on their shoulders. They named their children after gods of both fire and ice. And they believed that the world would end not in one element but in the collision of both. Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, would come in the form of fire and frost giants rising together. Frozen fire, the final chapter, but they did not fear it. They accepted it, because they lived it every day. This paradox didn't just shape Iceland, it shaped the Viking imagination itself. To be a Viking was to hold two opposing forces in your chest at once, to be brutal and tender, to burn with ambition and freeze with discipline, to be driven by rage and yet capable of immense stillness. It is why their ships cut through ice and storm, why their stories are filled with both cold vengeance and warm feasts, why their world did not divide things cleanly into right and wrong, good and evil, but accepted the mingling, the contradiction, the dance. Frozen fire. To some, it's an impossibility. To the Vikings, it was home. Because sometimes the strongest lives are forged not in peace, but where destruction and survival embrace, where fire teaches you to move and ice teaches you to endure, and where the soul, like the land, is split by flame, but held together by frost. He could run, the ropes are loose, the guard is asleep, the stars shine over the edge of the camp, and the sea is not far. His freedom is closer than it's ever been, but he doesn't move. He sits in silence, sharpening a borrowed knife, waiting for dawn. He is no longer a prisoner. Not really, he is something stranger. This is the paradox of the willing captive. When a man chooses the very cage that once held him. Viking society was known for taking captives. Raids often ended not just in plunder, but in people slaves who would be used, traded, sold. But unlike other cultures, the lines between captive and kin were not always fixed. A slave could rise in status. A prisoner could become family. A hostage could fall in love with the people who once burned his village. This wasn't mercy, it was absorption, conquest by culture, not just blade. Vikings didn't just take, they transformed, and some of those they captured didn't resist the change, they embraced it. Imagine being a monk taken from Lindisfarne at first. Horror, chains, foreign words, a frozen landscape far from home. But then, the chains come off. You learn their language. You tend the fire. You hear the sagas at night, stories of gods who bleed and laugh and die. You begin to see beauty in the wildness. And slowly, terrifyingly, you stop wanting to leave. This wasn't uncommon. Many captives eventually fought alongside their former captors. Some became bodyguards, smiths, traders. A few even married into Viking families. And when given the chance to return home, they refused. Why? Because the cage had changed shape. It wasn't made of iron, it was made of identity too. Be Viking was not a birthright. It was a way of life. If you lived it well, you could belong. And if you belonged, you no longer felt captured even if the rest of the world still saw you as stolen. There were even children raised this way. Hostages taken to ensure peace between rival clans. They were treated well, taught the language, given roles in the household, but always with a thread of tension. You are not one of us. Not yet. And yet, many of them became Vikings in heart, if not in name. This created a strange moral fog. Was it kindness? Was it manipulation? Did it matter to the captive who chose to stay? The question itself lost meaning. Even in mythology, this theme appears. Loki, a chaotic trickster, is both god and outsider, accepted into the divine family, but never trusted. Yet without him, the god's story cannot unfold. He is the willing captive of Asgard, choosing to stay, knowing he will someday be there. Because of its fall, the paradox deepens in the mirror. There were also Vikings who became captives in foreign lands and did not return. Some fought for the Byzantine emperors, some became guards for Arab caliphs, others lived among the Rus, the Franks, the Celts, and some stayed, married, settled, changed. What does it mean to be free, if your heart is tethered to a place you were never born into? What does it mean to be a prisoner, if you no longer wish to escape? This is not just about Stockholm Syndrome or forced loyalty, it's about how identity mutates, how the mind rewires itself when it no longer sees a cage as a punishment, but as a protection, a purpose. Start to the outside world. The man who stays is a traitor, a broken thing, but to himself, he is reborn, not as the victim of war but as the survivor of reinvention. The Vikings understood this deeply. They didn't just conquer land, they conquered meaning. And some of their greatest victories were not marked by blood, but by the quiet decision of a former enemy who chose to never leave. The willing captive becomes more than property. He becomes myth, because sometimes the deepest loyalty is born not from freedom, but from the moment you choose to stay in the place that once held you, not because you have to, but because you no longer remember who you were without it. The parchment crumbles at the edges. The ink has faded to a whisper. No one remembers the name of the man who held the sword, or the woman who crossed the ice, or the oath sworn beneath the aurora. The saga is broken, its ending lost, its beginning misremembered, and yet, the people it speaks of once lived, fought, wept, and shaped the world. This is the paradox of the forgotten saga, where the stories meant to preserve memory vanish, and those who once sought eternal fame are swallowed by time. In Viking culture, immortality didn't come from gods or magic, it came from memory. To have your deeds remembered in song, in carved stone, in firelit tales, that was the true afterlife. Valhalla was real, yes, but being remembered in the living world was just as important. Glory faded when the last voice stopped speaking your name, and so, they told stories, endless sagas of war and love, treachery and triumph. They recorded lineages, feuds, heroics, and disasters. Families passed them down across generations. Skalds sang them in courts and fields. Some were etched in runes, others lived only in mouths. Each tale was a lifeline, a rope thrown from the present to the past. But memory is fragile. Many sagas were never written. They were spoken, performed, shaped by the breath of the teller. A single war, a single storm, a single death could erase them. The skald might die before teaching an apprentice. The scroll might rot in a damp chest. A chieftain might fall in battle and his people scattered, his story lost with them. And so, while we remember names like Ragnar, Ivar, and Lagertha, we forget the thousands of others whose stories were once just as grand. The warrior who saved a village, the woman who defied her king, the poet whose verses moved the gods. All go not because they failed, but because no one kept the fire lit. That's the tragedy of the forgotten saga. Not failure, but silence. And The paradox grows deeper. Because the very people who built a culture around storytelling also lived in a world where survival came first. A bad harvest, a raid, an outbreak of plague, these things mattered more than the preservation of memory. Tales were told around the hearth if there was time, if there was food, if there was peace. Some stories were lost deliberately. A clan disgraced might have its saga buried. A traitor's name might be erased from stone. Even kings could vanish from history if their enemies ruled the scribes. The record of greatness became political, selective, edited. And sometimes, stories were altered to fit new ears. A pagan hero's tale might be retold with Christian flavor. A woman's valor might be downplayed. A failed voyage might become a noble sacrifice. The saga changed shape, but the original vanished. And yet, even forgotten, these sagas matter. The ground remembers, even if the mouth does not. A rusted sword unearthed in a bog. A burial mound built for someone we no longer name. A brooch passed from hand to hand. These are fragments of stories too quiet to survive whole but powerful enough to leave echoes. And in those echoes, something stranger happens. The forgotten saga becomes mysterious, sacred, open to reinvention. A blank page upon which new stories are written, half fact, half longing. We fill in the silence with guesses, myths, hopes, and in doing so we honor the dead, even if we cannot name them, because sometimes the story that fades becomes more haunting than the one that survives. And perhaps that's what the Vikings feared most, not death, not pain, but to be forgotten. To become a nameless stone, a sword without a tale, a grave no one visits. But here, centuries later, we still ask about them, still dig through ash and soil, still wonder what was lost. So maybe the saga isn't completely gone, maybe the forgotten only sleep, and maybe, telling new stories, we wake them, not as they were, but as they almost were. Because a saga is never truly dead, as long as someone listens for the silence it left behind. The arrow pierces his chest, just below the collarbone. He falls backward into the red snow, eyes wide but peaceful. Around him, the clang of steel and the roar of men fade. His last breath is a whisper to the gods. He is dead, undeniably dead. And yet, his name is already being spoken in a mead hall 1,000 miles away. His death is just beginning to live. This is the paradox of the Immortal Death, culture where dying well meant living forever, and where the end of the body was the beginning of the legend. To the Vikings, death was never the enemy. Cowardice was a man who died in battle, who met death face forward with a weapon in hand, was not defeated, he was chosen. His soul, they believed, would be carried by the Valkyries to Valhalla, where it would feast and fight in eternity. And even more sacred than this afterlife was the memory left behind. A good death echoed in songs. A great death became myth. So, the goal was not to live long, it was to die memorably. This attitude shaped every part of Viking life. A warrior trained not just to win, but to fall well. Elders told tales not of survival, but of glorious ends. Children learned early that a dull death, or death by age, by accident, by disease, was almost worse than death itself. To die old and unremembered was to vanish twice. And so, the Viking chased death not with fear, but with purpose. A raid was not just about gold, it was an invitation to be tested. To die in foreign lands was not shameful, it was poetic. It meant you had reached beyond your borders, you had dared, you had become a story. But here lies the paradox. The more they pursued this good death, the more they lived on. The man who fell screaming on the battlefield became the hero of 100 hearth fires. His name was carried by skalds, etched into stone, whispered to children. His body was gone, but he walked again, every time the story was told. And so, death became a form of life, one they could control, one they could design. Many sagas include scenes where warriors, sensing their end, prepare themselves. They dress in their best armor. They speak last words meant to be quoted. They choose where and how they die because they know they are building their afterlife with every decision. Even burial reflected this. A chief might be burned in a ship, his blade beside him, animals sacrificed, servants laid to rest at his feet. This wasn't just ceremony, it was storytelling. It was theater for the gods and the future. The way you died was the opening act. Of the tale others would tell for centuries, but not all who died well were good. Some were brutal, cruel, even hated. Yet if their death was dramatic, it was still immortalized. The paradox deepens. Morality was less important than memory. A villain who died boldly might be remembered more than a nobleman who died quietly. And sometimes, a man might orchestrate his own death for the sake of immortality, sacrifice himself for a last stand, trigger a war that would ensure his name would be sung for generations. His death was not an end, it was a strategy. This blurred the line. Between life and legacy, you could die young and still be more alive in the future than someone who lived to old age in obscurity. A short, spectacular death might outshine a full, gentle life. And for the Viking mind, that was not just acceptable, it was ideal. The mythology echoed this. The gods themselves were not eternal in the traditional sense. Odin would fall, Thor would die, Ragnarok would come, but their stories would last. Their deaths gave them permanence. The fall of gods was not their undoing. It was their elevation. So when a Viking fell, he didn't fear the darkness. He feared being forgotten. And when others watched him die, they didn't just see a body, they saw the birth of a legend. That's the paradox. That death, the thing we fear most, was not an ending in Viking culture. It was a doorway, a rebirth, a fire that lit the path into memory. Because for them, to die well was to never truly die, and to live in story was the greatest immortality of all. The village burns, the warriors shout. The spoils are gathered, silver chalices from a monastery, cloth dyed with foreign colors, livestock herded down the shore, and leading them all is a man who kneels every morning to pray to Odin, who honors his ancestors, who sees this act not as theft but as duty. He believes he is not doing wrong, he is fulfilling a sacred role. This is the paradox of the righteous plunder when destruction is framed not as evil but as virtue. To the Vikings, raiding was never just about greed. It was often viewed as a path to survival, to honor, even to divine favor. A successful raid meant the gods were with you. It meant your clan would eat through the winter, your name would be spoken in fireside tales, and your enemies would fear you. It was not chaos. It was order, seen through a different lens. From the outside, Viking raids appeared monstrous. Temples looted, civilians killed, villages burned. But within their worldview, these acts were embedded in a moral framework. Warriors were not plundering for pleasure alone, they were asserting their place in a cosmic hierarchy. They took what they believed the weak could not protect, and in doing so, they believed they proved their worth. Honor and violence were not contradictions in this world. In fact, they were intimately linked. To seize land, to take treasure, to humble a rival that was not just acceptable, it was noble. There were rules, even in plunder. A raider was expected to share the spoils with his crew. A leader who hoarded riches for himself would lose loyalty, face rebellion, or be shamed. Fair distribution was an ethical obligation. A man's strength was measured not just by what he could take, but by what he could give back. Even religious sites were not off limits, because Vikings were faithless, but because they saw no distinction between spiritual and material strength. If a church could not protect its relics, it deserved to lose them. If a god could not defend his followers, he was not a true god. To them, monasteries held treasure and power, and to take that power was not sacrilege. It was victory over a rival worldview. This wasn't callousness, it was logic within their system of belief. A raid that succeeded proved divine support. A raid that failed meant the gods had turned away. Either way, it was spiritual confirmation. Righteous plunder was not random, it was proof of fate. Many Vikings performed rituals before raids, blessings, sacrifices, dreams interpreted by seers. They sought omens, they prayed for strength. They believed their gods walked with them into battle. And so, when they set flame to a village, they didn't feel like criminals. They felt like instruments of cosmic justice. And yet, many were also traders. The same man who raided a coast one year might return the next as a merchant, offering goods, negotiating peace, forming alliances. He would walk through streets he once torched, shake hands with the sons of those he fought. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was pragmatism. Because in Viking ethics, context mattered more than principle. A raid was appropriate when strength needed to be proven. Trade was appropriate when strength had been accepted. In both cases, the act was about balance, about asserting place, controlling fate, honoring the clan. But this system had cracks. What happened when the raid was no longer necessary? When survival no longer depended on plunder? Some raiders found themselves adrift, trapped in a role that no longer served them. They turned to cruelty for its own sake. And suddenly, what had once been righteous turned hollow. Communities began to question these warriors. Skalds stopped singing their names. The gods, they said, grew silent. The line between honor and greed blurred, and in that blur the myth of righteousness began to unravel. Some Vikings tried to redefine themselves. They became kings, landholders, explorers. They founded towns: Dublin, Kew, York. They sought new forms of legacy, new paths to honor. But the memory of the old ways remained, heavy with contradiction. because deep down they still believed that to take something by force was not inherently wrong. It all depended on whether you were worthy of it. And so the paradox stands. Righteous, plunder. Where the thief sees himself as hero, where the burning of a village feels like an offering to the gods, where violence becomes virtue not by denial but by design, and where the line between sacred and savage is drawn not by morality but by whether the blade finds its mark. The ship rocks gently on dark water. All around, the sea stretches like a grave without edges, as beautiful, vast, and utterly inescapable. The men aboard sing to drown out the silence, to fight the creeping realization that they have become prisoners of the very thing that gave them freedom. This is the paradox of the sea's prison, where open waters offer boundless escape, and yet, over time, become a floating cage. To the Vikings, the sea was life. Their longships were marvels, shallow-drafted, fast, flexible. With them, they reached places no one thought possible. The British Isles, the coasts of France, the rivers of Russia, even the icy edges of North America. The sea wasn't a barrier, it was a bridge. It connected them to trade, to conquest, to stories. Their gods, like Enjerd and Aegir, ruled its tides. Their dead were sometimes given to it, their ships lit on fire and sent into the horizon. The more they depended on the sea, the more it consumed them. A Viking's life could be measured in waves. Children were born in coastal settlements where the wind never stopped howling. Boys learned to row before they learned to write. Men spent more time on salt-soaked decks than on dry land. The sea was both path and home. And yet, it was also merciless. Storms struck without warning, ships vanished in moments. Navigation was often done by memory, stars, birds, or whispers from the gods. A wrong current could mean weeks off course, starvation, madness, and still they returned to it, again and again. Why? Because the sea, for all its terror, was honest. On land, power was twisted, kings lied, feuds dragged on, oaths were broken. But at sea, survival was simple. Row hard, read the wind, trust your crew. The waves didn't care who your father was. The storm didn't ask your bloodline. You either endured or you didn't. But that honesty came at a cost. Many Viking warriors, who once raided and ruled, found themselves trapped by their dependence on the sea. They couldn't settle, couldn't rest. The land became foreign. The sea was all they understood. They were free to sail anywhere, and yet, they belonged nowhere. This was especially true for the Viking, or those who made a living raiding by sea. They were often outlaws, younger sons with no land to inherit, men with nothing left but a boat and a blade. To them, the sea was not just a choice, it was a sentence, a moving exile. And even for chieftains, the sea's grip was absolute. A leader with a fleet had power. Without it, he had nothing. His strength didn't lie in castles or walls, it floated on wood and wind. One broken hull, one lost voyage, and everything vanished on in sagas. The sea is both cradle and coffin. A hero might sail into glory, only to vanish in a storm no one saw coming. A woman might wait at the shore for years, only to find her husband's ship returned without him. The sea gave stories their shave and often their end. There were also deeper prisons, the emotional ones. Sailors who survived shipwrecks spoke of hallucinations, of hearing songs beneath the waves, of longing to return even after nearly dying. Some believed the sea had a soul, and once it touched yours, it never let go. That even on land, you would still hear it calling. The Vikings knew this. That's why they made offerings before a voyage, throwing silver into the water, sacrificing animals, whispering prayers. They weren't just seeking protection, they were trying to bargain with their jailer. Because they knew, the sea could love you for years, and still kill you without regret. And so, generation after generation, they returned, built ships, raised sails, followed coastlines like veins across the world. They feared the sea, they worshipped it, they belonged to it, that in doing so, bound themselves to a paradox they could never escape, because the sea gave them freedom, but only the kind that could drift away in the tide. And in the end, the horizon wasn't an open door, it was the edge of the cell. He walks among them, cloaked in fur, sword slung over his back, hair braided with bone and iron. The crowd quiets as he passes, not because they fear him, but because they know the stories. He is the man who killed a bear with his bare hands, the man who survived a storm at sea that swallowed 10 ships, the man who once died and came back. No one questions these tales, least of all him, because he doesn't just have a legend, he's become it. This is the paradox of the living myth, when a man is no longer seen as real, but cannot stop living. The Vikings treasured myth. They built their world around it: gods, monsters, runes, omens, and tales. But unlike other cultures where myth lived in the past, among dusty scrolls and vanished kings, the Norse kept their myths alive in the flesh. A warrior could become a legend while he still breathed, and once he crossed that threshold, there was no going back to become a living. Myth was the highest glory, and the heaviest burden. The sagas tell us of men who are larger than life: Egil Skallagrimsson, poet and killer; Ragnar Lothbrok, raider and king; Harald Hardrada, warrior and emperor. These were real people, but their lives became so twisted, with story that even today, no one knows where truth ends and tale begins. Did Ragnar really fight a dragon? Did Egil truly bury silver across Iceland? Did Harald's dying arrow truly mark the end of the Viking Age? It doesn't matter. The stories were believed, and that belief gave them power. But what happens to a man when his myth begins to outweigh his reality? He becomes untouchable but also unreachable. He is praised more than understood. People stop asking what he thinks or feels. They only want the next tale, the next impossible feat, the next roar of triumph that makes them forget their own smaller lives. And so the myth must grow. The man must keep performing more raids, more duels, more declarations of fate. He must remain fearless, ageless, flawless. He can never retreat, never cry, never doubt, because myths don't bleed, but men do. This is where the paradox strikes. The living myth is both idol and prisoner. He cannot step away, even when the weight becomes unbearable. To retire is to disappear. To grow old is to be mourned before death. To confess fear is to shatter the illusion. The people who cheer him would abandon him the moment he stopped being more than human. And often he knows this. Some tried to escape it. A few warriors disappeared into forests, into foreign lands, into silence. But their absence only fed the legend. He wanders still, they'd say. He's training for the final battle. Even when they vanished, they couldn't return. To being men, others leaned into it. They crafted their own myths, exaggerated their own tales, forged sagas like weapons. They became performers of the self, wearing their story like armor. But deep down, perhaps they wondered, do they own their myth, or does the myth own them? This paradox lives even in the Norse gods. Odin, the all-knowing wanderer, spent his life seeking secrets, but also projecting mystery. He sacrificed for wisdom but became trapped by the very stories he inspired. His legend required distance. Even among the gods, he stood apart. Thor, mighty and simple, had to remain brave, and when the end approached, Loki, the trickster, was hated and needed in equal measure. His myth too essential to kill, too dangerous to trust. And so it was with Viking heroes. They were needed to be larger than life, but once they became so, they were no longer free. Even death couldn't end the myth. If a warrior died spectacularly, the story grew. If he died quietly, the story changed to fit what was needed. The man vanished, but the myth continued, now out of his control. And so, the Viking world spun with stories of men who once breathed, but now burned brighter in legend than they ever did in life. The paradox remains. To become a living myth is to win the memory of the world, but to live as one is to slowly vanish behind your own shadow. The old man walks alone along the edge of the fjord where the waves kiss the stones with icy rhythm. Behind him, the village he once ruled glows faintly with firelight, but no voices call his name. No child runs to greet him. His name is still spoken in reverence, in memory, but his feet are no longer welcome on the land he bled for. This is the paradox of the honored exile warrior. So respected, he is remembered, and yet so rejected, he cannot return. Exile in the Viking world was not always a punishment. Sometimes, it was a solution. A man might be too powerful to kill, too noble to execute, too loved to disgrace. But if his presence stirred unrest, if his past ignited feuds, if his name brought blood instead of peace, then he would be asked to leave, not as a criminal, but as a sacrifice. That is the first edge of this paradox. Exile as honored, that to be exiled meant you mattered. You had caused change. You had left a mark. The village could not bear your presence, but it could not forget your deeds. You became a shadow cast across the hearth, a name spoken in quiet tones, with regret or longing or pride. You were banished, but never erased. Sometimes, exile came after victory. A man might lead a raid too brutal, a feud too bloody. He might avenge a brother in a way that defied the law but upheld the code of honor. And for that, he would be told, go, not because he was wrong, but because he was right. And the village could not survive the cost of his justice. In such cases, the man did not leave in shame. He left with his head high, bearing the full weight of what he'd done. And often, He did not go alone. A few loyal companions might follow, a brother, a lover, a skald to carry the story forward. Together they would vanish into the unknown west, to the edge of the sea, east, into the forests of Rus, south, toward foreign courts and strange gods. And yet, even as they left, they became legends. Tales of the honored exile spread quickly. His name was carved into ships, whispered into sagas. Children grew up hearing of the man who gave up everything to keep the law sacred. Some believed he would return when the time was right. Others said he had died building a new kingdom in the wilderness, but he lived on because he was gone. There were other kinds of exile too. Some were self-chosen. A warrior weary of blood might walk away from his clan before he was asked, not out of cowardice but out of clarity. He knew his presence brought danger, that his rage could not be contained. He chose to remove himself, not to hide, but to protect those he once loved. This was perhaps the loneliest exile of all, because no one asked you to go and no one asked you to come back, yet your memory lingered in every place you once stood. And then, of course, there were exiles who did return. Some came back after decades, older, quieter, full of stories from distant shores. Some returned just in time to die among their people, and some returned with armies, no longer asking for forgiveness, but demanding recognition. In each case, the paradox held. They were exiled because they were too much, too fierce, too loyal, too bound to honor in a world that could no longer afford it. They were remembered because they were missed, and they were missed because they had once mattered more than anyone else. Even the gods knew exile. Odin wandered in disguise. Loki was bound in chains. Freya gave up his sword for love and lived far from Asgard's halls. Exile was not punishment. For weakness it was the burden of those who had done something unforgettable, and so, the honored exile lives between two worlds. Not quite hero, not quite outcast. He is the man who stood too close to the flame of truth, and now walks alone in the cold shadow it left behind. But wherever he goes, he carries the village with him. And in the village, even after generations, his name remains spoken by those who know that sometimes the greatest price of greatness is leaving the very home you died to protect. The chest creaks open, gold coins glint in the firelight, dazzling and silent. A jeweled brooch catches the eye. A blade with runes etched in its hilt rests beside a silver goblet, still stained with ancient wine. The raiders cheer. They've found it. The hidden trove. The forgotten hoard. Riches beyond imagining, but none of them smile for long. One grows ill. Another turns on his brother. The ship that carries the gold runs aground. What they thought was a blessing begins to unravel them. This is the paradox of the cursed treasureware. What is most valued brings only loss, and the greatest fortune conceals the seeds of ruin. To the Vikings, treasure was more than wealth, it was proof of honor. Spoils from a raid told a story. A golden cross meant a monastery had fallen. An exotic trinket meant you had crossed oceans. Arm rings, necklaces, and rings weren't just adornments, they were symbols of power, tokens of loyalty, and evidence of victory. But they also came with shadows. Not all treasure was celebrated. Some was hidden, buried beneath runestones, sealed in caves, sunk in lakes, not out of practicality, but out of fear. It was believed that certain riches carried curses, that treasure taken from sacred places or won through betrayal would bring death or madness. Even wealth acquired honestly could turn against its owner if hoarded too greedily or worn with too much pride. And so, paradoxically, the very thing the Vikings pursued across land and sea was also the thing they most feared to hold. There are countless stories in Norse legend of cursed gold. The most famous is the hoard of the dragon, Fafnir, a treasure stained by murder and greed. Whoever possessed it was doomed. Sigurd, the hero who slew the dragon and took the treasure, ultimately fell to betrayal and death. The lesson: treasure doesn't just tempt thieves, it tempts fate. And this wasn't just myth. In real Viking life, treasure could be a source of tension and doom. A leader who kept too much for himself might face rebellion. A ring passed down from a disgraced ancestor might be seen as a harbinger of bad luck. A stolen relic might attract not only vengeance from the living, but wrath from the dead. Some clans refused to touch gold taken from certain places. Others buried it in secret, believing that to let it see daylight again would invite disaster. But this didn't stop the search, because that's the heart of the paradox. Treasure was feared but still chased. No amount of legend or loss could dull the lure of wealth, because to possess treasure was to possess power. It bought loyalty, settled debts, elevated status. It could change a farmer into a warlord. It could buy ships, hire warriors, build dreams. And so, The Viking raiders took the risk. Every voyage was a gamble, not just against storms or swords, but against the invisible price their treasure might carry. Would this golden brooch bring glory or death? Would the silver cross please the gods or enrage them? There was no way to know. Even in burial, the paradox appeared. Great warriors were often laid to rest with their finest possessions, jewels, weapons, coins. But this created another risk. Grave robbing. A dead man's treasure was sacred. To take it was to invite a curse. Many believed the spirit of the dead would haunt the thief, bringing nightmares, sickness, misfortune. Yet graves were still robbed, because even when they believed the treasure was cursed, they believed more strongly in what it could offer. That's the tragedy of it. The cursed treasure is not just a thing, it's a mirror. It shows you what you desire, then it takes it from you and leaves you questioning whether it was ever yours to hold. The Vikings, for all their wisdom and warning, could not look away from that glitter, and neither can we. We still chase what gleams, we still covet what destroys us. We still believe that this time, maybe, the curse won't come, but it always does, because every treasure has a cost, and the more you value it, the deeper it carves into your soul. The village was dying, crops failed, trade routes dried up, enemies grew bolder with every moon. So the elders sent for him the old warrior who had once brought them victory, now living in exile. He returned without hesitation, sword on his back, fire in his eyes, and when the next raid came, he stood like a wall against the tide. He saved them, he drove the invaders into the sea. He was their hero again. And then they asked him to leave. This is the paradox of the doomed salvation, when the only one who can save you is the very one who ensures you can never truly be free. In Viking society, heroes often returned in times of crisis. Former warlords, feared raiders, or outlawed champions were called upon when things grew desperate, when there were no more options, and the wolves were at the door. Their presence brought strength and danger, because they didn't return as humble servants, they returned as forces of nature. Their ways were old, brutal, effective. They knew how to win, but they brought with them the storm they once embodied. Their arrival brought not only salvation but chaos, resentment, and fear. People remembered their victories but also their violence, their past crimes, their recklessness, their curses, and yet without them, the village would have burned. The paradox reveals itself in the aftermath. The people rejoice, they feast, they raise horns in the warrior's name, but soon they grow uneasy. His presence is too large, his shadow too long. He commands loyalty from the younger warriors. The chieftain feels outshined. The elders grow nervous. Whispers rise like smoke. He saved us, yes, but how long before we need saving from him? So they ask him to leave. They thank him with gifts, songs, honors, and exile. Again, because they needed the fire to survive the frost. But they cannot live beside it forever. This pattern repeats across the Viking world. In sagas, we see it clearly. A hero returns to right a wrong, settle a blood feud, defeat a monstrous enemy. But once peace is restored, the same traits that made him savior make him dangerous in a world trying to be calm. He doesn't belong anymore. His rage, his code, his need for glory, they clash with the daily rhythm of crops, trade, and law. So he leaves, sometimes in anger, sometimes in quiet understanding, because even he knows he is not built for peace. He is built for moments of fire. Take the tale of Grettir the Strong, a mighty warrior, cursed and exiled, feared by many. Yet even in disgrace, he protects people from trolls and outlaws. He saves those who fear him, and in the end, he dies alone, remembered not just as a hero, but as a threat the world could never fully accept. Even the gods aren't spared this paradox. Loki, the trickster, saves the gods as often as he endangers them. He helps build Asgard's walls, he brings them tools, insight, even children who become key to the divine order. But he is also the seed of their destruction. They love him, they exile him, and when the end comes, it is he who leads the charge against them. He was both their savior and their doom. The Vikings understood this tension. Power, once unleashed, can't always be contained. The warrior who wins the war isn't always the one who can build the peace. The very traits that bring salvation, ferocity, ruthlessness, obsession, can poison the world once peace returns. And yet, in every generation, when the world darkens, again, someone lights the fire anew. They call back the old ones, they summon the exile, they invite the storm, because in the end, survival matters more than comfort, even if the cost is unbearable. So the doomed savior walks alone once more, not out of defeat but because he completed his role, and because those he saved cannot bear the weight of what it took to be saved. He is remembered, revered, feared, He is the sword they needed, and the peace they could not keep while it remained. Drawn because some saviors were never meant to stay, only to come when the world forgets what it means to burn. The battlefield is red and wild. Men scream, steel clashes, the sky is thick with ash and sound, and in the heart of it, there he stands, the Berserker, eyes hollow, breath steady, not foaming at the mouth, not lost to rage. He is terrifyingly calm. This is the paradox of the Berserker's calm, where the most feared warrior is not the one who loses control, but the one who controls his loss. The word Berserker conjures images of madness, men stripped to the waist, howling, biting shields, rushing into battle with no fear of death. Too many, they were monsters wrapped in human skin, fueled by bloodlust, immune to pain, detached from reason. It was said they wore the skins of bears, or wolves, Berserker, bear shirt, and fought in a trance-like fury. Odin's chosen avatars of chaos. But this image, while partly true, hides something deeper. A Berserker's greatest weapon wasn't just as rigid was his mastery of it. That to enter the Berserker state wasn't just a matter of passion, it was a ritual, a preparation. Some may have used herbs or chanting, others fasted, meditated, prayed. This wasn't a spontaneous was a controlled ignition, a fire that burned only when it was called, and when the rage came, it didn't always look like madness. Some Berserkers moved silently. Their expression didn't change. They weren't lost in the moment, they were fully inside it, focused. Calm in the center of the storm. That was what made them so dangerous. Because true terror isn't always loud. Sometimes, it is cold, measured. It walks toward you without blinking. It smiles before the first strike. The sagas tell of men who fought 20 at once, of Berserkers who shattered shields with a single blow. But they also speak of moments when the rage stopped, when the warriors stood still in the midst of slaughter and did not breathe hard. Because for them, rage wasn't the absence of control, it was the peak of it, and this paradox extends beyond battle. In Norse myth, Odin is the god of both war and wisdom. He inspires fury, but also discipline. He teaches warriors how to let go of fear, but not of focus. His ravens watch, his wolves wait. His own fury is never random. It is shaped, wielded like a blade. The Berserker mirrors this divine example. He may be chaos to his enemies, but inside, he is often still. That's the secret. Rage ungoverned is wasteful. It burns out fast, but rage harnessed, that is a tool of gods. It's not just physical. The Berserker calm is mental, emotional. It's the part of the soul that says, I am ready to die, and therefore, I am free. No fear, no flinching. Not because the warrior is numb, but because he has made peace with violence. He has accepted the cost before drawing the blade. Imagine the fear this inspires. Not a man shouting, but one who walks into your line with no words at all, who moves with patience, who watches as you panic, who fights not like an animal, but like death incarnate, inevitable, unhurried, unafraid. The sagas often describe Berserkers this way, not just frenzied killers, but chosen warriors, special, marked, sometimes cursed, sometimes holy, feared by both enemy and ally. That fear didn't come from madness, it came from how still they were before the storm, and there's a cost after. Battle Berserkers were said to fall into weakness, days of exhaustion, of emptiness, of sleep that could not be broken. Some wept, some raged, some vanished into the woods, never to return. Because channeling that power came with a price. To burn like that means losing part of yourself. But they accepted it. That's the final piece of the paradox. The Berserker doesn't fight despite the cost. He fights because of it. Because he has accepted that the world is made of breaking, of fire and bone. And in that acceptance, he finds peace, not joy, not satisfaction, just calm. A calm that kills. And so the image lingers on old shields, in half-burnt scrolls, in the echo of songs once sung across the north. Not a scream, but a silence before the storm. The calm of a man who has made peace with his own destruction, and walks forward, not to lose control, but to wield it. A pyre burns under the twilight sky. Smoke rises into the cold air as the last of the great ones is set adrift. The village gathers in silence. His sword lies with him, his runes carved into stone. His story, they say, is over, but it is not, because in the Viking world, endings were never truly endings. This is the paradox of the final beginning, where every death births a new saga, and what ends in fire begins again in memory, myth, and fate. The Vikings believed that time did not simply move forward. It looped, circled, folded back on itself like waves on the shore. To die was not to disappear, it was to return, to a hall beyond the veil, to a child born with the same fire, to a name remembered with such force it shaped the future. When a warrior died in battle, his story didn't end, it began anew. His name was sung in the mead halls, his deeds were exaggerated, immortalized, twisted into fable, and then, without warning, they began to shape the choices of those who came after. Boy hears how his father stood alone on the cliff and held back 10 men, and one day, the boy does the same, not because he must, but because he carries the weight of that legend. The ending of one life becomes the beginning of another path. One death becomes 10 decisions. This wasn't just superstition, it was design. The Norse didn't build monuments to preserve the past, they built stories to reignite it. Even their gods lived by this loop. Ragnarok, the end of the world, was foretold not as destruction, but as a necessary reset. Odin would fall, Thor would perish, the world would burn and flood, and then it would begin again. Green shoots rising from blackened soil. New gods, new stories, a final act that was never final at all, because in the Viking soul, to end was to plant something, a legacy. A revenge, a name that could never stay buried, even in how they buried their dead. This paradox was carved into the ritual. A chieftain might be sent off in a burning ship, but the fire was never just farewell, it was announcement. It told the sea, the gods, the world, this man lived. Watch what happens next. His possessions went with him, not just for use in the afterlife, but as proof of who he was, and who he would inspire. The runstones left behind didn't just mark graves, they told stories. Here lies so-and-so, who sailed to lands no other man had seen. He fought bravely. He avenged his kin. These were not eulogies, they were seeds, planted in stone, waiting to grow, and what grew was never simple remembrance, it was action. Each story became a thread in the tapestry of clan identity, a reason to fight, a reason to stay, a reason to go, a reason to be more than you are, and so it becomes clear. The final beginning is not a contradiction, it is the only kind of ending the Vikings trusted, a beginning you don't recognize until it's too late, a death that wakes something else up, a silence that echoes for centuries. Even in personal life, this paradox held true. A woman who lost her husband might take up the family's trade, changing her path forever. A failed raid might lead to a new alliance. A betrayal might drive someone to greatness. What looked like collapse was often the first stone of a new foundation. This was the Viking strength, not in denying endings, but in using them as fuel, as prophecy, as call to arms, because they knew something we forget, that every loss contains direction, every fall contains weight, every ending demands an answer, and they gave one with axe, with voice, with memory. So now, as this final paradox closes the circle, listen closely. You've heard tales of savage honor, peaceful raids, frozen fire, cursed treasure, but the story doesn't end here. It never could, because even now, someone out there is hearing it for the first time and beginning something new. Maybe that someone is you. Maybe that beginning is already underway. Even now, even here. In the silence after the saga ends, it was never just swords and sails. It was never just fire on the horizon or bones buried beneath frost. The Viking world, for all its chaos and cruelty, moved according to something deeper, an unseen force, a rhythm not written in stone but etched in contradiction, a kind of ancient machinery built not of iron and wood but of stories, instincts, and paradoxes. That was the true engine behind their age. And now, as the last saga fades into the night, we stand before a forgotten engine, still turning, still whispering, still alive beneath the ash. What made the Viking world so haunting wasn't its brutality, it was its balance. For every savage act, there was sacred purpose. For every betrayal, a deeper loyalty. Their lives spun between opposites, fire and frost, silence and scream, exile and glory. These weren't just contradictions, they were the foundation of their worldview. Paradoxes weren't obstacles to be resolved. They were truths to be carried. A man could be both hero and villain. He could save a village and be cast out from it. He could be remembered for mercy earned through slaughter. A woman could be both shield maiden and seer, tender in one breath and terrifying in the next. Gods could be wise and deceitful, mighty and doomed. The world didn't have to make sense to be lived in. In fact, the Vikings knew it wouldn't make sense. They didn't demand certainty from the universe. They demanded strength from themselves to face it anyway, and that's why their stories endure, because we still live inside these contradictions. We chase freedom but long for fate to give us meaning. We crave peace but glorify war. We honor the dead yet fear being forgotten. We hunger for gold even as we believe it might curse us. We tell stories not because they are clean, but because they are full of splinters and smoke and blood. Just like the Vikings did, their paradoxes weren't fantasy, they were architecture. They shaped how the Norse saw death, destiny, time, and self. And those paradoxes still echo today, even if the longships have rotted and the sagas are unread. Even if the gods are silent and the runnerstones weathered, smooth, you can feel the echo in the way we romanticize heroes who break the rules, in how we fear power, yet long to possess it, in how we talk of legacy, of honor, of sacrifice, without ever truly knowing the cost. The paradoxes in this journey: savage honor, peaceful raid, frozen fire, living myth, doomed salvation, they weren't just about the past, they were warnings and mirrors. They remind us that to be human is to be pulled apart and stitched together by forces that don't agree. And yet we go on, we carry the contradictions, we become them, and through that carrying we live. The Vikings didn't seek to perfect life, they sought to face it, with blade and word, with silence and storm, with fear and song. They knew life was short, often cruel, always uncertain, but they also knew it could be made meaningful not by explaining it, but by embracing it. That's the final lesson of this forgotten engine. That time, like history, doesn't run in a straight line. It loops, it returns, it reinterprets itself in firelight and memory. The sagas don't end because the people are gone. They end because we stop listening. And if you've listened this far, if you've drifted across these 25 paradoxes, letting them settle into your bones, then maybe, in some quiet way, the engine has turned once more, not loudly. Just enough. Because that's how time works, not with answers, but with answers, not with certainty, but with a paradox that keeps us wondering: what do we carry forward, what do we leave behind, and are we brave enough to live in between?